Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves, and today I want to tell you about the books that I read in the second half of April. I didn't have a whole lot of things that I got through because I spent the last week in New York City with my mom and my sister doing a kind of whirlwind crazy trip that did not have much reading involved at all. I read on the plane and that's about it. Other than that, we were just basically walking 10 miles a day through New York City, seeing shows. I saw a rat on the subway. That was pretty spectacular. We saw Saoirse Ronan and Ben Whishaw in a staging of The Crucible that was just like phenomenal. I saw Stephen Colbert, which has been kind of a really long time dream for me. I realized as soon as he came out on stage that I've been watching him since I was like 16 years old, and that's a long time to be watching one person on a daily show. I watched him on The Daily Show, and then I watched him on The Colbert Report, and now he's on Late Night, so that was really cool. The taping that I went to, they filmed an interview with Anderson Cooper about his new biography of his mother that they wrote back and forth through emails. I didn't even realize that Anderson Cooper was a Vanderbilt. Maybe I'm stupid and everybody knew that, but it was really interesting, and now I definitely want to check that out. Other bookish things, we went to the Strand, which is like that bookstore in New York that they always say it's 18 miles of books, and I bought a couple Dos Passos books. We went to the New York Public Library and I saw supposedly Mary Poppins umbrella, her original umbrella, and I also saw at the library a first edition of Moby Dick, which was kind of exciting. There were like some bookish things thrown in. A great trip overall. But because I was gone for the past week, I didn't read a whole lot, so in this video I will be talking about 2 novels that I read and 2 graphic novels, comics that I read, and then I will kind of talk about the things that I'm reading now, so let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about that I read is Neuromancer by William Gibson. This is something that I've been meaning to read for a really long time. Everybody talks about how it's the beginnings of cyberpunk, and I am interested in that as a genre, even though I have to admit when I read these things or when I watch these movies, they're not necessarily super interesting for me. So this was a really difficult read for me to get into. Very similarly to a book like A Clockwork Orange, the book has its own vocabulary, and it has a lot to do with computers and the internet, and while it is true that this book was like revolutionary in thinking up how people were actually going to respond to something like the internet or a global network, how hacking might work and how criminality might develop in this like heavily technologically determined world. Reading it now, I really was not as excited about those aspects of the book. Like David Cronenberg's movie Videodrome, I think the book does a great job of world building. There is just an overwhelming amount of detail that really gives you a clear picture of what the world is going to look like. And it kind of reminded me of like Blade Runner meets Tron. So if those are things that are really interesting to you, I think you would really like Neuromancer. For me, I do love Blade Runner, but it's because I like that kind of detective noir quality to Blade Runner. It took me a really long time to get into the sci-fi aspects of that movie, and I think that with Neuromancer I would also have to read that multiple times to really appreciate the plot of the thing rather than just the setting of the thing. It also has those noirish type elements, but it just wasn't quite for me. I can see why people respond to it so strongly. I can see why it was revolutionary and why it won all these awards. I can see that it's a fantastic novel, but I do not want to put in the time and attention to really understand it, if that makes sense. The next thing I read was The Honorary Consul by Graham Greene, and I just absolutely fell in love with this book. When I was in college, I read a whole bunch of Graham Greene in a row, and I think I was most attracted to his kind of expatriate stories, or the stories that take place in Mexico, South America. I think that he does that really well, although his kind of political thrillers are also really fun to read. I just think that the ones about people displaced in other countries and his more religious books are actually a little bit deeper, or maybe I just can access that depth a little bit easier. This story is about a small group of British nationals who are living in Argentina, and one of them, the main character in the book, is a doctor, and he's half Argentinian, half British, so his loyalties are kind of split between the two, and he gets involved in a kind of revolutionary guerrilla type group that kidnap the wrong man. They're trying to kidnap an American consul and hold him for ransom, but they kidnap this honorary British consul who is like really no good to them. Nobody really wants to pay this guy's ransom. So they start to get into the value of human life, what that means in a revolution, what that means as a political concept. In the meantime, there is a kind of love story going on between the main character and the kidnapped man's much younger wife. The main character in this is just despicable. I mean, he is incapable of love, he is selfish and not empathetic at all. He doesn't care about the honorary consul really that much at all, but at the same time as a doctor he has this kind of ethical dedication to the value of human life, and so he fights for the consul's life even though he has no really sentimental interest in it. It is just fascinating, and as always, the way that Graham Greene thinks about religion, particularly the Catholic religion and ritual and rites, is really revealing and thought-provoking, and I just loved this book, The Honorary Consul. It's going to be one of my new favorite Graham Greene books. I think my very favorite is The Heart of the Matter. The End of the Affair is really good. I'm thinking of all these now that I really love. Graham Greene's just a master. His short stories are good, Brighton Rock's good. I could go on and on, but this is my most recent favorite. The first graphic novel I read in the second half of this month is Veil by Greg Rucka, and the art is by Tony Fazzula. I thought that the art in this book was really quite incredible. Here is the very first page, and you are already just completely drawn in by this image, right? Just a girl naked, covered in rats. Doesn't get much more disturbing than that. And the art continues in that style. Sometimes you'll get like a first image that's in a very much more detailed or artistic or expressionistic type style, but this one sticks to that kind of abstracted art, which I really liked. The story was meh. It was kind of stuff that I've seen before in comics, which I think is something that I say often about comics. I don't want to reveal too much here in case that you are very interested in this, but it has to do with a woman learning about her special powers and learning how those powers are going to be used to control her and how she can break free using those powers. And that's something that I saw in Fatale. It's something that superhero narratives deal with a lot, and frankly I'm getting a little bit tired of that vein in the comics world. One thing that's really nice about Veil is that it is a complete finished story, so you can get this, I guess it's not a trade paperback, it's a bound up edition of 5 of the issues of Veil, and there aren't going to be any more, so you can read the thing from beginning to end. It's very clear. If you are not used to reading comics that much, this would be a great one to start with, especially if you haven't read a lot of comics. The themes in it are going to be way more fresh to you. So that's Veil by Greg Rucka and Tony Fazzula. And the second graphic novel that I read is Polarity by Max Bemis and Jorge Coelho, and I also had mixed feelings about this book. Its visual style is a little bit more straightforward than Veil's is, a style that I'm used to seeing in comics, but a style that's really straightforward and I enjoy reading in comics. The story itself is really interesting. It's about a man who is bipolar, and through his like bipolarity, he's going to become a kind of superhero. So whenever he is manic, he has all of these powers, but when he takes his medication and gets his mania under control, he doesn't have any of those special qualities anymore. So it's a really interesting examination about where you end and the mental illness starts, whether mental illness is some extension of yourself, whether it's some kind of like add-on, or whether it's a core part of your identity, whether or not you're split into sick and well. Those are all really interesting concepts. The one thing that I didn't love about this book is the kind of contemporary allusions it makes. Lots of references to like hipsters and hipster type music and books right now, and there's this kind of like cynical, I sometimes call it angry nerd undertones to it. I'm a nerd, nothing against nerds. Obviously I'm a nerd, I'm on BookTube, right? But I have a little bit of a hard time with the kind of like cynical, you're not part of our club nerdiness that isn't like all encompassing and tends to label people as posers, for example. That bothers me. Like, let's all be nerds together and let's all respect each other's things, right? So this book really lacked that kind of respect, and it gave it this mean quality that I didn't love. But the superhero thing in it is really fun. It's a new take on it, and it kind of like highlights things that are just true about all superheroes. That kind of duality is something that we think of all superheroes having, so it's interesting when the comic very explicitly labels that second identity as mentally ill. And I'm finishing up two things right now that I want to talk about briefly. One is American Passage, The History of Ellis Island by Vincent Canado. This is very detailed. It's basically the history of immigration in New York right around turn of the century. It starts a little bit before then, talking about the construction of Ellis Island, and then it's going to go up to the 1950s. Ellis Island closed in 1954 officially. So right now I am little over halfway through. There's a big section of notes, so actually a lot over halfway through, and I have learned so much. I've learned about the reasons that immigrants were barred, the kind of public perception around immigration and certain immigrant groups and how those shifted and changed. And actually it's making me feel like quite patriotic. Usually I feel like books like this on American immigration are quite distressing and disturbing, and this one has those elements, but at the same time he talks about really good people who are doing really good things, and the way that somebody's personal ethics could contradict with official rules quite often and in really kind of inspiring ways. I wouldn't call the book inspiring or heartwarming. It's pretty dry academic kind of text, but just making me feel good about my trip to New York and seeing Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty off there in the distance. And the thing that I read on the plane was Stephen King's Bag of Bones. I've been reading it on my Kindle, so no point holding it up. It's just a Kindle. I've read about 600 pages of this thing. I think I have like 150 more pages. It's a long one. I can't say that it is a literary masterpiece, but it is a great pick for an airplane. I feel like longer the better on an airplane, and the more accessible the better. So something like Stephen King or John Grisham or Michael Crichton just pushes me through those airplane rides, and it went by really fast. So those are the books that I read in the second half of April. I am now pretty pumped on New York. This was the first time I had been, and I am wanting to read some more New York fiction. When I went to the Strand, I was looking for some stuff to pick up, and like I said, I picked up Dos Passos. I felt like that was appropriate for a New York book, but if you have anything New York centric for me to read, especially some great nonfiction, I would love that. Also, tell me what you've been reading this month. Let's talk, and I will see you in my next video. See ya.